Dear attendees and youth, good morning and welcome. We hear from young people around the world about the support they need to succeed as active citizens and change makers in transforming education. Unfortunately, despite their increasing engagement in informal platforms, social movements, and digital technologies, youth participation in formal decision-making structures is limited and often tokenistic. The session, The Right to be Heard, positioning adolescents and younger people at the center of transforming education, will challenge participants to center younger people throughout the test to together ensure adolescents and younger people are at the center of the change and can achieve the education they need and demand to safely and healthily transition to adulthood. This session is dedicated to demanding a shared commitment to younger people as equal partners at the table in the transformation of education. I'm so excited today to have with me a group of inspiring panelists who represent governments, multilaterals, and young people. We have with us today Mr. David Tseng, the Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education and Chief Innovation Officer for the Directorate of Science, Technology, and Innovation in Sierra Leone. Ms. Catherine Russell, the UNICEF Executive Director. Credo Ganso, an activist, innovator, and leader for climate justice and environmental protection. He runs the NGO Poly-Afrique Bio, which works to restore green spaces. He also is a trainer in social innovation program called Upshift, where he helps to create the next generation of change makers in his history. Benin, in his country, Benin. Also, we have Renate Adriaansens as a feminist, advocate, and organizer. She is active as National Gender Youth Advocate to UN Women and co-founder and president of an organization for young feminists in the Netherlands. Shama Bolangas is a queer feminist from the Philippines. She serves as co-chair of Transform Education, a feminist coalition of youth-led networks and young activists with the mission of accelerating progress for gender equality in education, hosted by the UN Girls Education Initiative. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to be the moderator of this session. And I am Rana Boujaber. I'm a Lebanese social activist and youth advocate. I am a human rights and leadership trainer, secretary at a local environmental NGO. I am also a member in the regional UNICEF Youth Advisory Group and youth representative of UNICEF Lebanon. So let's start with Ms. Russell. Ms. Russell, as a director of UNICEF, what role do you think younger people should have in responding to the learning crisis, and how should they be supported?
Well, thank you very much. It's just so nice to be here, and thank you so much for that question. I think that, the perspective of UNICEF, of course, is that children and young people need to be at the center of the response, but I think I would say something, a little bit of a challenge to the young people here, which is that a lot of times people say that, right? And it seems like the obvious thing to say, we all say it. But I think it's really important that as we go through the next 2 days and indeed continue the work, that you all hold us to account for that. I think it's incredibly important. The reality is that we won't get very far if we don't engage directly with young people. We need your perspectives, we need your problem-solving skills, and we need to understand and appreciate the difficulties you face and learn from the solutions that you're already coming up with. In my first few months, I've been here now, I guess a little over four and a half months at UNICEF, I've had the chance to speak with young people in many places around the world, in the Pakistan, Afghanistan, Rwanda, Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's been interesting to hear about the challenges they face and the ideas that they have, the issues that they're looking at around mental health, the challenges they face around mental health, their concern about what their opportunities will be in the future. They know how important their education is, and they know that their learning has been affected by the pandemic. They know they aren't getting the skills they need to make the transition from school to the workplace and to make the most of their lives. But they are also at the forefront of their communities and their countries, and that's what I think is critical from our perspective. From Thailand to Uruguay to Jordan, ministries of education are consulting much more, and maybe we'll hear this from the minister, with young people on curriculum reform, on learning recovery. Youth advisory committees are important and are really working with governments and with UNICEF, which we're grateful for, on formal and non-formal education programs. And young people are also at the forefront of reaching their most vulnerable peers, which is so rewarding to see that they're reaching out to other young people. In Iraq, young volunteers are teaching technical skills to vulnerable adolescents. In Tanzania, young graduates are working as peer teachers in remote communities. And we're seeing a lot inside Ukraine and in neighboring countries where young volunteers are helping younger children to keep up with their learning, as well as providing emotional support for displaced children. You'll hear a lot more about this shortly, but UNICEF is launching a global poll today to seek the views of almost 23 million children and young people in about 90 countries, all on the learning crisis. And we hope to use the information that we learned from this in discussions and try to leverage commitments this September at the Transforming Education Summit. So I think that the key here is that young people need to be front and center in transforming education. But adult decision makers need to do a lot more to make that happen. It is ultimately our responsibility. And I think as much as we want youth participation, we're not trying to put the onus on young people to figure this out. We have to work in partnership. But you do have to hold us to account, and you do have to push us hard. And I think we all very much want that, even if it's not the most pleasant experience sometime, to be held to account. But national and local governments need to create robust mechanisms that directly engage young people in designing programs that affect their well-being, and allocate, and this is probably the most important thing, allocate sufficient funds to support these efforts. We also need to help young people build teamwork, communication, conflict resolution, and leadership skills. Those things people aren't born with those for the most part. Those are learned skills, and as adults, we sort of take it for granted because we've picked it up along the way, but we need to really work with young people to develop that. These will help them succeed as they make the transition into work, family responsibilities, and community leadership. And finally, and most importantly, we need to do more than just commit to transforming education. We need to deliver on our commitments, to hold ourselves accountable for the results. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hello. Check. Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Unmute. Thank you so much, Catherine Edie Russell, for that. And just to actually add to what you're saying, I think that the partnership that we're building, right? It's good that you've mentioned that there's leadership from the Global South, right? It's good that you've mentioned sharing decision-making and sharing resources as well to be able to move this forward, but that partnership needs to be at the motion of trust. We need to move at the speed of trust. And what that means is that all of us need to know and need to trust that we have the good intentions, and that we need to be patient with ourselves, that we're all learning. You're learning, we're learning, all of us are learning together. And this is a recognition that a lot of our world leaders, actually not a lot, all of our world leaders are not immune to lifelong learning. And that's really what we need to do.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shama, for intervening. Thank you, Mr. Russell. Actually, you framed the conversation. You touched on many key elements concerning learning and education, like mental health, opportunities for participation, learning to earning, the importance of making institutions accountable for young people. Now, let me turn to Minister Sengi, who has some first-hand experience of both sides, as a till very recently a younger person himself and now representative of institutions. So, Mr. David, in your dual roles as both Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education and Chief Innovation Officer, you sit at a very interesting convergence. So, technology can be an ally in engaging younger people to play an active role in education, but also technology can be hard access for the most marginalized. So, what should ministers of education do to make sure that as many younger people as possible can participate and be engaged?
Thank you. I didn't know that you graduated me from the young people's side. It's okay. As a CIO and minister, I mean, I think it's one of the things that this crisis showed us was how technology can serve as a divide, or really, well, technology shows us the divide. It shows us the class divide, it shows us the income divide, it showed us the generational divide. We could dwell on the risks and the challenges and the divisions that technology enhances, but I really like to think about it as well as it can serve as an opportunity for transformation. Technology can help us think about ways in which we can accelerate and achieve and meet our SDG 4 targets and benchmarks. You know, it can be a way in which we can help with learning poverty, with the children in crisis, and all of these challenges that are evident. I think technology really, for me, is just a means to enhance transformation. And if we think about that, then it becomes a question of how do we do that? For us in Sierra Leone, some of the ways we think about it is through hybrid technologies. So hybrid is really important for us within the Directorate of Science, Technology and Innovation, and we try to apply that within the framework of education as well. I think last week I was in a meeting and I said technology goes all the way from a paper to the metaverse. And somebody in response said, yes, it goes all the way from a pen to a spaceship. And I think if we think about this, that a pen is a technology, actually, in the same way that we think about a spaceship or paper and versus metaverse. The opportunity then becomes, how do we use the paper in areas where children are behind the river and there's no road there? And it's the responsibility of us to make sure that they get access to that state-of-the-art technology, that latest technology for them, for learning. And where we can enable and think about, I don't know, how do you build? I was talking to some people yesterday and they were saying about using the metaverse for empathy and collaboration. Now, these are all important, and when we think about problem solving, when we think about system change, we have to deploy hybrid systems. And for us, it really is important. That means in Sierra Leone, we think offline first. Most people are not connected. We think mobile first, such that you're not just building and using solutions that require technologies that are not available to most people. The second point really is around connectivity, and this is something that we collaborate with UNICEF, because it's important for us to think about connectivity. For me, I think connectivity should be a right. Access to information is a right. The point about bringing internet to everybody is not a privilege. It's that this is a way in which we can have all books available to that child. This is the way in which we can ensure that communities have access to information. And it's only true information that will allow us to think about how we can apply critical thinking, how we can solve problems, how we can be good global citizens, how we can be connected to solve problems. And we need to understand that these technologies, these platforms, these frameworks should not be privileges. And particularly where they enhance and enable learning and collaboration, it's our responsibility as governments to make sure that these communities have them. Yes, it is expensive, but it's an investment. And finally, on what we can do with regards to technology, we really have to think about the different mindsets and the shift of mindset. And that shift of mindset really has to be, how do we use technology? How do we build technology to enable us to reach all the children that we can reach? Thank you.
Wow, absolutely. Amazing, we absolutely agree. Yes, Renata.
Yeah, and I'd love to come in on that as well, because I really appreciated how you spoke about technology as a tool and really to bridge those gaps. And I think that's incredibly important, that we keep using it as a tool and see innovation as a way to connect more people and to reach more people. So thank you.
Thank you, Renate. Actually, we need to be bold and creative, and technology deliberately designed in a way that is inclusive can get a lot done to include younger people in shaping the future of education. And speaking of inclusivity, I now turn to you, Renate. You are a national gender youth advocate and president also of an organization of young feminists. So you advocate a lot about the importance of meaningful and inclusive youth participation. So how do you think this can help address the education crisis?
Yeah, so I think before I get into that, I first want to acknowledge my privilege in being able to be here. I am able to be here because I have one of the Schengen nationalities, which means I don't have to get a visa. I am able to be here because I was available on short notice, but so many young people do not share these privileges, and so many youth advocates so wanted to be here and so needed to be part of these conversations that we're having in these spaces these days. So from that, so we must really ask ourselves, how can we talk about meaningful and inclusive youth participation when so many voices of youth are not even able to be in this room? And it is the diversity of these voices that really make youth participation meaningful and inclusive. So when it comes to the education crisis, as Edie Russell said, and as Minister Senge said, children and young people who are in all their diversities the most affected should be an integral part of how we've shaped the solutions moving forward. So meaningful youth participation is truly working with young people from the beginning and throughout, recognizing their expertise and sharing the power in decision making. So to put this in practice, it means deliberate investment and deliberate design. So let's take the example of this conference where we're at right now. Some really good steps were taken in this, such as the creating of this full day on youth, and we definitely need that. And also the opportunity for you to have consultations as input for the Youth Declaration. So to do this, UNESCO invested time, they invested resources, they created processes and followed through on that. Yet there's always still work to be done, working towards more inclusivity, intersectionality, and power sharing, and as well as following up and making sure that this youth declaration that we will be forming actually inputs the eventual outcome document of the summit is incredibly important. So I'm really happy that there is meaningful and inclusive youth participation that is here, but we can and we should strive for more to be able to transform education. So when I speak here, I also speak from the multiple communities that I am a part of. I am someone with an invisible disability, and I have experienced and seen around me all the ways in which education is inaccessible. This goes from hard-to-reach classes, teachers who aren't willing to adjust for accessibility, to educational materials themselves not being accessible. So as someone from the Netherlands, I am fairly privileged in that position, and I still experience many of these issues. But for young people with a disability that come from poorer countries or poorer environments, this disability represents an even higher barrier. And when I speak of disabilities, I do speak of all disabilities, even though there are different accessibility needs. So I speak of physical disabilities, invisible disabilities, people with mental illness, people that are neurodivergent, Disability intersects with all other dimensions of the learning crisis, and it creates barriers that exclude those most vulnerable. But it's not our disabilities that make us disabled. It's an inaccessible education system and an inaccessible society that disables us.
Thank you, Renate. Thank you a lot.
I think there's one thing I would like to comment. Rana, if I can, I come in. There are instances and programs where organizers have good intentions, but don't have technical capacity to include all the youth at once. So some of the youth should be like relays. In my case, for instance, 1 year ago, I had access to a social innovation learning program called Upshift that equipped me with skills and mindset to become social, to deliver social impact. Since then, I became mentor, and I trained more than 100 adolescents in my country to become change makers, problem solvers, and social innovators to deal with global issues affecting their lives. That's what I want to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Credo. Actually, I love the idea of Renate taking this conference as example. And let us never forget how disability as a dimension intersects with the learning crisis, making things impossibly complicated for the most vulnerable children and vulnerable young people. So, Credo, you are bringing the perspective of climate change, which intersect and quiet punishes with the learning crisis. So, as a climate change advocate, how do you see climate change impacting education?
Thank you for the question. I think I would like to start by saying that it is very important to acknowledge the current climate crisis as a child rights crisis. I think this is the only way to realize that children and even the youth face a number of challenges due to impacts of erratic and unpredictable changes in the climate. And one of these is the access to quality education. For instance, because of flooding, children are not able to access roads to get to schools. And even schools are not resilient to adverse climate and environmental shocks. Water shortages mean that girls have to walk long distances to fetch water and miss out on their education because they have to prioritize meeting these basic needs over school attendance. It must also be recognized that in many areas, parents' agricultural production is increasingly at risk because of drought. And the resulting income and food insecurity affects also children's education because some parents are not able to afford sending their children to school. And some children might have to go to school hungry, and this affects the performance at school. So if children are not safe, if they do not live in a safe and healthy environment, if they are not protected from extreme weather disasters such as floods, drought, heat waves, and other environmental catastrophes such as rising sea levels, destroying their homes, cyclones, typhoons, tsunami, and earthquake, they will not be able to go to school and stay there. I strongly believe that if children face fewer shocks and fewer risks, they will have an easier time going to school and studying in good conditions. And this is an opportunity to recall that Article 6 of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change calls for public education to be a part of the response to climate change. So I think climate change disrupts education, but education can also disrupt climate change. We must realize that children and youth should not only be seen as victims of climate change, but also like valuable contributors to climate actions. They must be educated and well equipped to be the problem solvers the world needs them to be. And I think this should be our goal for transforming education. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Credo. And I just really want to come in here quickly because last November, my small city, I come from a small city in the Philippines, and we were hit by a really huge typhoon. And I almost thought I was gonna die. Our house was destroyed, our ceiling fell down. The government was not as helpful, and I know that some of the ministers are here. No one was rushing to get kids to school back, get kids back to school and restore education because our schools were used as evacuation centers. My former high school teachers had to ask me and some of my classmates for like 200 pesos, 100 pesos in order for them to be able to get ink to reprint some of the modules that were completely washed out. Had to reprint some of the grades and recalculate some of the grades because they were washed out by the typhoon. Because our school is in a hill and the roofs were completely torn out. My mom, God bless her soul, and I love her so much, she on her own accord had to visit her students by herself in order to really check up on them. Gas was very expensive and we had to use our motorcycles, but we wanted to do it because we wanted to check in on them. My point here is that our teachers shouldn't have, and our students shouldn't have to make up for the failures of our institutions to respond. We need to step up in getting ready and getting resilient, as much as I hate that word, but we have to be. And suffice to say, ESD, or Education for Sustainable Development, gender equal climate education is the first step to get us there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shama, for sharing this. I guess we can take a slogan from what Credo said, that climate change disrupts education, but education also can disrupt the climate change. So back to you, Shama. You are an advocate for gender education and gender equality in education. So you are also active in defending the rights of queer people. What is your perspective, and how is the education crisis differently impacting these groups?
Thank you very much, Rana. Marajaw na buntag sa ato tanan. That's how we say good morning in my language. There are 180 languages in the Philippines, by the way. Bonjour à tous. I first want to recognize my privilege. Renat has also already mentioned it, but for my topic, my privilege as a cis straight passing person. And also the first in my family, even in my neighborhood, to be able to come to Paris. And sorry. I feel very honored to be part of this panel. Rana, sorry. So, when we talk about gender equality in the world of education, right, we're talking about seriously interrogating power structures. Who gets to decide inside schools, even inside our society in general? My friend here has beautifully put how we can look at it inside this conference and inside this summit. I want to talk about society in general. Unfortunately, for us, queer and feminine bodies, indigenous peoples, garment and factory workers, persons with disabilities, undocumented students, teenage mothers, us from formerly colonized countries, Uncle Ben was wrong. With no power actually comes a lot of responsibility and a lot of systemic violence. For LGBTQ+ students and marginalized identities everywhere, the education crisis has been ongoing and persistent, and has only been worsened by the pandemic, the climate crisis, and conflicts and wars going on everywhere. What this means for LGBTQ+ students specifically, and I'm speaking from my own experience and experience of my peers, inside schools, because we have no power, nobody really cares enough to give us any type of relevant curriculum. What that means is that we have had to rely on our own personal research. I've had to rely on BuzzFeed quizzes to know if I was gay, and honestly, if you had to ask, maybe you are. We are forced to make continuous, unnecessary adjustments to our day-to-day routine in order for us to just avoid violence from our peers, from other violent students, and some of our teachers even, and some administrators, from being cautious of what we wear, being very hyper-aware of what we wear so we don't get misgendered or suspended or fired because of uniform policies. And even as small as not knowing which bathroom to go to. Outside of school, we are exposed to images of violence against women, young girls, and queer people. The criminalization of our identities and our rights in some countries, and even the regression of our rights in most. I don't know if this is too political, but I really want to say Roe v. Wade. As a young activist from a majority country working on gender-based violence, not only do we just get peanuts for our organizing, we get threats of rape and actual harassment from some cis straight men who just don't get the point and maybe want to prove whatever their point is. And some of us even get disappeared by our own governments for speaking truth to power. Unfortunately, we only have primarily anecdotal evidence for violence in schools. As UNESCO Bangkok published in 2017 a report on school-related gender-based violence or school-related violence on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity expression, there's virtually no data on the violence in schools, at least in the countries that were in that report, as it pertains to bisexual, trans men, and intersex learners.
Sorry, Shama, for interrupting, but we're running out of time. If you may please.
Can I just, yeah. There's also virtually no formal grievance mechanisms for us to be able to address these instances. And when everything moved online and we all moved online, it was more difficult to monitor these instances. The goal is not just to add girls, young women, and queer people and STIR and then gender equality. It's to create actual structures that address these power inequalities. And as a young queer person and others before me, I stand in solidarity with those who almost couldn't be here because of visa problems, because our passports are not as powerful. I stand with those who are not here. Let this not be an extractive exercise. We don't share our experiences of oppression just so you feel good that you've listened. We are here to offer a hand in partnership. This is an opportunity for us to have survivor-centered interventions, for us to do no harm, and to center safe schools as we transform education for a very transformative education. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for highlighting this. Thank you a lot for these important insights from the life in school for LGBT+. these realities are systematically ignored. So thank you a lot for highlighting this. And as you know that UNICEF has recently launched a global poll to ask children and younger people about their experiences of learning crisis and the action they want decision makers to take. So Shama, may you please tell us more about this?
Sure. Sorry, I just cried earlier and now I'm like shifting. As Catherine has already earlier mentioned, an additional opportunity is being provided for young people to express their voice on the way to the Transforming Education Summit in September. As Minister Senge, as David has mentioned earlier, there are a lot of ways for us to be able to connect, and this is one of them. Europort is a global platform, a digital platform for young people to use, and it's joined by almost 23 million young people in 90 countries. In a poll that just launched, you can see around 3,000 voices of young Europorters who already told us what leaders should do to help every child and young person learn basic skills. As more youth voices are joining, we invite you to listen to what we have to say. You can visit www.europort.in or IN to learn more about what young people would like world leaders to do to address our learning challenges. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. This Europort poll is definitely a good complement to the various sources of input that the Office of Youth Envoy is using to develop that declaration. So finally, very briefly, I'm going to ask a question for Ms. Russell. What is your message to the community of decision makers around TESS?
Thanks. I think, first of all, I am so grateful for all of your comments. They were really powerful and just incredibly great contributions, so thank you for doing that. I would just make a couple quick points. First, we can't transform education for this entire generation without actively engaging the members of that generation in finding solutions. And I think, as Renata said, really importantly, it has to be quite deliberate, right? We can't do this by accident. We have to really make sure that we're including this generation. Second, decision makers have, this is a moment. It is actually an opportunity here in the lead up to the summit to create and, importantly, to fund mechanisms that engage young people and center their perspectives. I think it is quite an important moment for decision makers to come to the table. And